Welcome to the League of Women Voters guest speaker session of our Council 2023. Our very special guest today is Elisabeth Griffith. Elisabeth is a historian, an academic, an activist, an author, and an expert on American women's history. Her biography of suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, entitled In Her Own Right, was hailed by both Oprah and the Wall Street Journal as one of the 5 best books on women's history. It was also the basis of Ken Burns' documentary on Stanton and Anthony, entitled Not for Ourselves Alone. According to the Los Angeles Times, Betsy's new book, Formidable: American Women and the Fight for Equality, 1920 to 2020, is a thorough and thoughtful account of the struggle of white and Black women to expand their rights. The New York Times review found Formidable an engaging, relevant, sweeping chronicle. Griffith delivers a multiracial, inclusive timeline of the struggles and triumphs for both Black and white women, a profoundly illuminating tour de force. High praise indeed. Betsy graduated from Wellesley College with a doctorate from American University, and she's been teaching women's history for 40 years. She marched for women's rights in the 1970s with the National Women's Political Caucus, and before that, she led the Women's Campaign Fund, a forerunner of Emily's List. Her 22-year tenure as head mistress of the Madeira School, a girls' boarding school and day school in McLean, Virginia, earned the Washington Post Distinguished Educational Leadership Award. A member of the Society of American Historians and Veteran Feminists of America, she's been a Kennedy Fellow at Harvard and Klingenstein Fellow at Columbia. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Elisabeth Griffith. Thank you, Dr. Griffith.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Going to have a moment of tech while we get the screen share up and going. Let's see if you're seeing what I need you to see. Okay. I hope you're seeing a title page. Hello, League of Women Voters Council of West Virginia. I feel that I should start by saying that Lucy Madeira, who founded a high school for girls in 1906, grew up in Martinsburg. And always thought of herself as a West Virginia woman, and you have a state with a proud history of formidable women. I've learned in preparing for today that when you got statehood in 1863, the question of whether to include women as voters was actually debated. It would have been remarkable if you had been admitted as a state with women voting in your constitution, and if you had the United States Senate probably would have turned you down. In 1869, Wyoming was the first territory, not yet a state, to offer women voting rights, and they did it as a marketing strategy to bring more women to the state because you needed a population of 60,000 to become a state, and they were trying to grow their population. So in addition to voting, they offered equal pay for women teachers. But West Virginia women also began campaigning for voting rights as early as 1867, when a state senator named Samuel Young, who was from Pocahontas County, asked to revise the state constitution to remove the word male so that women would be considered voters. And the effort was taken up again in 1895 by Delegate Harvey Harmon, who was from Harrison County, and he would become really your state's leading legislator, advocating with women supporters for women's suffrage up until the 19th Amendment was ratified in West Virginia. Yours was the 34th state to ratify. You ratified in March 1920, and it required 36 states, and Tennessee would be the 36th. During this period is when the League of Women Voters was founded. To celebrate 50 years since the Wyoming Territory gave women the vote in 1869, Carrie Chapman Catt, head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, convened their annual convention in 1919 and called it the Jubilee Convention to mark that anniversary. And it was at that meeting that she, anticipating that suffrage was finally going to pass after its long, hard fight, she anticipated what would she do with the 2 million members of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she suggested organizing the League of Women Voters, that it would be the most appropriate and patriotic memorial to finish the fight and to aid in the reconstruction of the nation at the end of the Great War. The motion did not pass, which was really quite unusual for anything that Carrie Chapman Catt proposed, because she was a power woman. But it didn't pass because her close friend, hold on, we are not advancing here. There we go. Her close friend, Jane Addams, had an alternative proposal. And only someone like Jane Addams would have been of equal power to Carrie Chapman Catt. These women had been friends for a long time. Jane Addams, of course, is the woman who founded Hull House in Chicago in 1891. She really created the career of social work, bringing in people to work with immigrants and with factory workers and to try to improve living conditions. And Addams and Catt had been allied in efforts for international peace before the war, and they would continue that alliance into the 1920s. But Catt, equally famous, had a counter proposal, which was that members should instead create an organization. They should create the league, but it should be for civic education and community organizing instead of more active participation. Whereas Catt wanted something that would urge women to register to vote, to volunteer for parties, to draft legislation, to run for office. Jane Addams was saying, no, not yet. We should not be partisan. We should just be an active educational group. And in some ways, it's a great, it's really a change, because the National American Women's Suffrage Association had been a brilliant national strategic organization. And the women who were members had carried out a complex, multi-tiered, multi-ethnic, biracial, national, had created this coalition. They were really a powerful organization, and to become an educational organization seemed a little bit anticlimactic. They did, however, draft a plank. So in 1920, in March of 1920, before suffrage had ever passed, Catt calls the Victory Convention, anticipating victory, and they become the League of Women Voters, and they draft this plank of issues, which they propose to both parties. And while this says to the Democratic Platform Committee, it was the Republicans who adopted it. The Republicans took, at that time, viewed as a much more liberal party. It's hard to envision that, but they were, because the Democratic Party was controlled by segregationist white Southerners. But the League was engaged. They would have counted this as an educational effort to educate the parties about what women really wanted. So thank you for inviting me to talk about my book. I'm proud of having written this book. I hope it makes two contributions. One is I hope it puts in one book 100 years of history, sort of like a book I hope you've read or have on your shelves called The Century of Struggle, Eleanor Flexner's study of 100 years that got us to the suffrage victory. And this is what happened after 1920. What did women do once they got the vote? And the second contribution that I'm pleased that the reviews are picking up on are the attention paid to, paid equally, I think, to Black and white women, because both Black and white women were formidable change agents. They had worked very hard briefly together for suffrage. They would work on parallel tracks after suffrage passed because of how deeply rooted racism was in our country and how strongly enforced segregation was. So these women could rarely be public allies. And white women bore a lot of responsibility for prejudice and bias on their part, which had led to distrust on the part of Black women. So along parallel paths, Black and white political women would be moving for change. They would have different agendas and different strategies, and they didn't either have as much success as they might have liked. The title worked well for me because the idea of women voting caused fear and dread among men, and the fight was so big that people might have been hesitant to attempt it, but the women who did attempt it were an impressive crew. My book begins with certification of the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920, by Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby. He added the 19th Amendment to the Constitution at home in a private ceremony at 8 o'clock in the morning with no photographers and no special guests, because the opponents were bringing an injunction in federal court at 9 o'clock that morning. And had he not acted swiftly, we probably would not have gotten suffrage until after the Second World War. The 1920s would not have been a time for getting it passed. The Depression stopped everything in its tracks, then the war. So it would have been the end of the 1940s before American women got the vote. This was a period with some comparison to the era we were in 2020, because it was a period of enormous racial strife, an uptick in racial violence, beginning with sort of the resurgence of the Klan in 1915, but from 1915 into the 30s, too much lynching, and people had only begun to count it and to pay attention to it. And even today, Brian Stevenson, with his equal justice initiative in Montgomery, is still trying to track the accuracy of lynching statistics. There had also been an international pandemic. It was a period of great turmoil in our country. Harding wins, you recall, because he promised a return to normalcy, although the 1920s was not normal compared to the decades before. My book ends in October of 2020 with the confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett. I couldn't bring myself to write about the election, but I have young, my agent and my publishers are younger than my children, and they thought that this was a depressing ending. So they said, write a little bit more. And that allowed me to go and talk about the inauguration. And the hardback ends with Amanda Gorman and her poem. And that inauguration, if you remember, President Biden in his remarks made reference to the suffrage march in 1913, and many people were wearing yellow, gold, purple, white in recognition of the suffrage colors. I'm very pleased, really thrilled that the hardback sold very well. So the publishers sped up the publication of a paperback, which came out in October. I think that's what's probably been available to you. And I got all excited because I thought I'd get to correct the 2 grammatical errors and the 1 factual error that I'd found, and I hope you never find. And I thought I could add some more information, and they said, nope, costs too much money, you cannot do that. And I said, well, we cannot publish a book in this era immediately after the Dobbs decision has been handed down that's talking about women's rights and such a basic right without making some reference to it. So they let me add 5 paragraphs filled with subjunctive verbs about what the Dobbs decision might mean for the election of the midterms. I'm glad most of that came true. So if you have the paperback, you have a little more information, and one could claim that it's ending on a depressing note again. But that only proves that the arc of history that bends toward justice is not really a smooth little rainbow arc. It's a jagged course, and women have made progress and have faced setbacks, and all of that is included in my book. But because I'm talking about women, this is not only a political history, but it's also social history, because a lot of changes that have had impact on every single one of us had nothing to do with legislation. This is the first Miss America. You'll recognize Betty Crocker, whom I learned was more popular than Eleanor Roosevelt in 1936, Billie Holiday, Rosie the Riveter, Nichelle Nichols, who the lead actress on Star Trek, who took her prominence to lobby to have African Americans and women be allowed to compete for NASA astronaut spots. That's Brandi Chastain. There are many women, artists, poets, athletes, Nancy Drew, fictional characters in the book, because sometimes things that have nothing to do with politics, legislation, or Supreme Court decisions change women's lives. Getting rid of corsets and shortening skirts in the 1920s meant women could breathe better, and they could then be more athletic, be more outdoorsy, be healthier. Things like that changed. Having improvements of household domestic tools, to have a mix master or a refrigerator as opposed to an ice box, had enormous change for women. So I think you have to include this information too. And there are lots of Barbies in my book, because Barbie, first introduced by the Mattel Company in 1959 to great controversy because of her dimensions and supposed sexuality. And at that time, her wardrobe was only airline stewardesses and secretaries and nurses. Barbie has changed with the times. There are now Barbies of every complexion. There are non-gendered Barbies. There are flat-footed and thick-waisted Barbies. And that demonstrates, I think, all of the changes that have affected women's lives. And this is, in a way, an important symbol for children who play with these dolls. And of course, I love that Barbie has won for president many times. I'm disappointed that the only photos I could find were of blonde white women, although a brunette who ran with a female on the first all-female ticket. But I do love that Barbie, of course, always has really sparkly inaugural dresses. But this is more women running for president than have in reality. And that's something, if girls are playing with a doll who's running for president, that has impact. So 1920, we won. We won suffrage. 27 million women were enfranchised. That more than doubled the size of the electorate, because there were more women than men at that time. This is the language of the 19th Amendment, named for Susan B. Anthony. This would have driven Elizabeth Cady Stanton nuts, because when she introduced the idea of suffrage at the 1848 convention in Seneca Falls, New York, Anthony was not there. She didn't meet Anthony until the 1850s, but they were a team. Stanton was really the visionary, and Anthony was the person who organized the meetings, checked the membership rolls, collected the dues, kept the movement going. And as you will read, the vote shall not be denied on account of sex. The word woman does not appear in the Constitution, and it still does not appear in the Constitution. On account of sex in 1920, people had a pretty good idea what that meant. On account of sex has become more fluid in recent years, that's turning out to be very helpful. For example, on account of sex in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act has allowed the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court, to protect LGBTQ employees from discrimination, to my amazement. So these are the two women that Secretary Colby refused to invite to the signing on August 26th, because everybody in Washington knew they couldn't stand each other. So over 100 years campaign for suffrage, there were 3 generations. Stanton, Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Lucy Stone were the grandmothers. They were all dead. Carrie Chapman Catt represents the middle generation, college-educated professional women. And the third generation is Alice Paul, who was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania when she went to England to do research and got swept up in the British suffrage campaign, which some of you will remember was pretty much a domestic terrorist organization. They blew up mailboxes. They had lots of, they endangered the public in their campaign. Alice Paul was jailed and force-fed 7 times before she came back to the United States. And when she came back to America, she imported out what were known as outdoor tactics, marching, picketing, standing on street corners and speaking. And she pretty much enlivened the suffrage movement with her activities. But Alice Paul, we cannot prove that Alice Paul ever changed one vote in favor of suffrage. And because she also imported a parliamentary point of view that the party in power was responsible, you had to hold them responsible. In 1912, Wilson won, and the House and the Senate were also controlled by Democrats, but there were not enough Democrats, nor were they as pro-suffrage as some Republicans. You weren't going to pass a constitutional amendment, which requires 2/3 of the House and the Senate and 3/4 of the states, by only appealing to Democrats. The entire Senate was against it because it was controlled by Southerners. So it wasn't going to work. So Kat calls Paul stupendously stupid. The two women do not speak to each other from 1917 on, have never appeared in public since that time. So it was diplomatic of the Secretary of State not to invite them to come. But these are the principal players. One is the strategist and the vote counter running the state and a local campaign, wooing Wilson, and you have Paul nagging Wilson, which was never going to work. Suffrage wins because Kat was a brilliant strategist, because Paul was excellent at PR, because women had participated in the war, because they were already voting in some states, and because of a single vote by Harry Byrne. So here's the program of the 1913 March, which had 5,000 women participating, and they never got farther, if you know Washington, than the National Gallery. They got from the Capitol to 4th Street, 4 blocks, when a drunken mob basically surges into the street and stops the march. The police were ineffective, and they had to call the cavalry from Fort Myer to clear the road so that they could finish the march, but it was hours later than they expected, and so they missed the tableau vivant that was being staged at the Treasury building. This is Columbia. They had liberty, they had freedom, and all these little children, but it was March and they were all freezing, so they went inside. But it did make headlines, especially the fact that there was a riot. Paul in 1917 would be the person who, so the 1913 March was the first time women had marched in Washington, big deal, because it would be unseemly, of course, for women to march. And 1917 was the first time anybody, male or female, had picketed the White House and its cast members of the National Women's Party. And in April they began in January. In April, America declared war against Germany because of the submarine warfare. And these banners changed and said things like, Kaiser Wilson, what will you do for women's suffrage? How will you protect democracy at home? Which the bystanders thought were offensive. And so they attack the women, and the women get jailed for disturbing the peace and get very harsh sentences, which creates more sympathy, some sympathy for suffrage. But again, no votes. Women did earn respect and probably change some votes by serving in the war effort at home, in factories and farms, and overseas. They were telephone operators in the front lines. The United States in 1917 had the 19th largest army military in the world, following Portugal, and had no stockpile of munitions, but had this advanced technology. And so women served in that capacity. And women proving their patriotism in the war also allowed Woodrow Wilson, anti-suffrage, reluctant against suffrage, a Southerner, to say that suffrage was a war measure, and that the Congress should pass it because other countries, we were fighting for democracy abroad, we ought to give women the vote at home. That was part of Carrie Chapman Catt's strategy with him. And I remember I said a 2-level campaign she'd been working, the National American Women's Suffrage Association had been working on a state level. We had mentioned Wyoming as the first territory to give women the right to vote. It didn't become a state until 1890. And it had women in its constitution as voters, and the Senate turned it down, and they said, we won't become a state unless you let women vote. And because they wanted a Republican state in the Senate for balance, they gave Wyoming the vote. In the purple states, women could vote at every level. In the orange states, they could only vote for president. In the Confederacy and some of those other states, they couldn't vote at all. In the orange states, if you were white, you could vote in the Democratic primary. But altogether, this is, let me think if I can remember, it's 19 million women voting. Before they got national suffrage, they had some kind of voting. And that voting, of course, influences both presidential politics and state congressional politics. So this was a huge factor that women were voting. But it comes down to Harry Byrne, 24 years old, a Republican from Knoxville, Tennessee. So they got to 35 states. They were desperate to find a 36th. Tennessee had a Democratic governor. They strong-armed him into calling a special session. Everybody went to Nashville to campaign, including the liquor lobby, which maintained a 24-hour hospitality suite. Carrie Chapman Catt was in the Hermitage Hotel and said, everybody in the legislature is drunk. The Senate sobered up enough to pass, so it's down to the legislature, and they do not have an accurate whip count. Harry Byrne enters the chamber wearing the red rose of the opposition. But he has in his pocket this letter from his mother, and his mother says, please bring me home some new sheet music. Please support Mrs. Cat, ratify suffrage. Don't forget to be a good boy. So because one young man changed his vote, 27 million American women got the vote. And he did it because his mother told him to. I love this story. So 19th Amendment passes. It covers Black and white American women. But not unlike the 15th Amendment, Black voting rights in the South are not going to be protected. There will be discrimination. It will be very hard for any Black man or woman living in the South to vote for a long time after 1920. But because many Blacks had begun to move out of the South, they could form political organizations. Native Americans were excluded because there had been ongoing fights about whether or not Native Americans were citizens. Even saying that sentence just baffles me, because if they weren't citizens, they were inhabitants who'd always been here. In 1879, a Ponca Indian chief, that's an Oklahoma tribe, had managed to secure a federal bill that would count Native Americans as citizens. But by 1881, they had repealed that bill. And so these two women were very active in the teens and 20s and worked to pass the 1924 Native American Citizenship Act, which restored citizenship to Native Americans. But citizenship is not the same as voting rights. Citizenship is federal. Voting rights are controlled by state legislatures, of which we have so many examples at the moment of how it can be controlled and removed. Another group that was not included were Asian immigrants who had been encouraged to come to this country to help build the transatlantic railroad, because Chinese especially were expert in dynamite and they built the west to east half. But as soon as the railroad was complete and they stayed in America and became competition for jobs, then this act was passed and it was extended to include all Asians, all Asian and Pacific Islanders, and it would not be repealed. Go back, I can't go back. Forget this. It wouldn't be repealed until 1943, when we were allied with China, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek comes and asks the government to repeal it, and then they add Japanese and other Asians in the 1950s. So what you saw, I'm not sure I can get it back. Oh, good. So in 1920, women are voting. Some women are voting. Many fewer women voted than were eligible to vote. No scholar has been able to figure out why. They don't know if the deluge of negative arguments about why women should not vote, they weren't smart enough, they didn't belong in the political arena, it was too rough and tumble, it would disrespect their husbands and fathers, they were already represented, it would take time away from their motherhood roles, all these things may have depressed voting. But the turnout in 1920 was the lowest it had been since 1900, and before that 1820, which was before Jacksonian democracy expanded the vote to white propertyless men. In 1820, it was just white men with property, so that percentage of turnout must have been pretty low. They did change where people would vote in 1920, paying attention to the what would be appropriate for women. Prior to 1920, men voted in saloons where they could smoke and drink and swear and spit. And they hated that the voting booths were switched to fire stations and libraries and schools. But they made this effort to encourage nationally, so anticipating that people would vote. And the Girl Scouts of America showed up to babysit, so the child care issue would be taken care of, but women did not turn out. The threat of women possibly turning out helped for a while, but not for very long. And nobody counted. You'd think if women were voting for the first time, somebody would stand out a polling booth and do an exit poll. Nobody counted women voting until 1976, 1980. Gallup poll did some polling in the late 40s, early 50s. We know that more women than men voted for Eisenhower, more women than men voted for LBJ, but there are no records, really statistically accurate records of how women voted. But since they started counting, We know that more women than men have voted in every presidential and midterm election since 1984, which is a pretty big deal. And Black women, if they could vote in 1920, were voting Republican. They were voting for the party of Lincoln because they believed that every bad thing that had ever happened to them was due to Democratic control of state legislatures in the South. And now you have Black women as the backbone and the winning percentage in electing Democrats nationally. There's wonderful ironies in history. So women get the vote, and this, the suffrage sisterhood splinters. And it wasn't just between Black and white women, but everybody had gone into suffrage wanting what they wanted. Social workers wanted to improve immigrant rights or factory women's rights. Women wanted to improve their communities. They wanted to be like, white women wanted to be like white men. They wanted to be elected and passing legislation, and they had their League of Women Voters agenda. Black women had a much broader, in some ways, much more significant agenda to end lynching, to end Jim Crow, to protect their communities. And it was a Black community agenda. It wasn't just Black women, it was a Black men and women agenda, but they were had a very significant role. So I'm going to talk about both of these cohorts for the moment. So white women ran for Congress. Only 11 were served. Not all of them were actually elected. Some were appointed, and most of them were related. And if they were related, they served very short terms. They might have gotten a term as short as 2 weeks, or they might have filled a term for 6 months. They might have even won election, but they only served one term. The three without family ties served much longer, sort of had earned it on their own and won it on their own. And again, mostly Republicans, because it was a Republican decade. These two women are significant because look at their tenure, 26 years, 36 years. These women served long enough to rise to leadership and committee chairmanship. So Mary Norton is chairing the House Labor Committee when Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act are passed, and she is shepherding them through. And Edith Rogers is serving on the military, the Armed Services Committee during the Second World War, and she's making sure that there are roles for women in the war industries and in the military auxiliaries, and not just white women, but white and Black women and Chinese American women. She made sure that this was going to be a diverse cohort. I'm introducing you to Adelina Otero Warren. Hispanic women were prominent and active in southwestern states, Arizona and New Mexico principally. Otero Warren had been state superintendent of education. She'd been a colleague of hers would be elected Secretary of State during this era. She runs for Congress in 1922, and she does not win, and she determines not to run again because even though she has been married twice, she is now in a same-sex relationship that she doesn't think is going to survive Washington. So she and her partner become cattle ranchers, but she's on the brand new quarter. She's one of the women who's getting a new quarter. And just to be factually accurate and inclusive, I'm introducing you to Rebecca Felton, technically the first woman senator, first woman to serve as United States Senator. Mrs. Felton was 87 years old in 1922, and she served for 24 hours. She had been appointed by the Georgia governor because he wanted to win women votes in his upcoming election. She was the most prominent suffragist in Georgia, pro-suffrage, pro-white only suffrage. She was for lynching, she was an anti-Semite, and again, technically, which I'll explain, she was the last member of Congress to have owned enslaved people. She was born in 1835. She married a plantation owner. He owned the laborers, the enslaved labor, but no woman in the 19th century owned anything. You didn't own your body, your clothing, your children, your property, your inherited property. You inherited nothing. But she had control over these workers. She serves 24 hours. She casts one vote for a naval appropriations bill, and she gives a speech that says, I'm clearly making everybody uncomfortable now, but more women will come and they will serve with integrity, and the session closed by paying her travel expenses back to Georgia. The real first woman elected to the Senate was Hattie Caraway, a Democrat from Arkansas, a pro-ERA feminist in the 1930s. Her husband had died. She was appointed, but then she won a full term. She won 2 full terms against male opponents. And they put her in Rebecca Felton's seat. And she said they didn't want to contaminate any other seat. So she was stuck in Felton's desk. This was the agenda. This was created by the League of Women Voters began it, but 8 white women's organizations endorsed it. Several of these social justice feminists suggested that Black organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, whose emerita head was Mary Church Terrell, and I mean that there were clearly prominent and active Black women in the NAACP and the Coalition of Colored Women, but they said, no, we're not including them. Oops, I didn't correct the slide. Prevention of lynching. They did stick in prevention of lynching. But the major emphasis was on maternal and infant health. And this was huge then and huge now. In 1920, the United States ranked 20th. They only counted 20 countries. Today, we are 78th. They count 150 countries. We are the only country with a decline in maternal and infant health. And it's because of racial disparities in care. The issue was not identified as racial disparities in 1921 when the Shepard-Towner bill finally passed. It was rural and urban, but that's sort of paralleled. If you're in a rural area, you don't have access to the kind of medical care you need. This only passed because the men thought they would be voted, that the women in their districts who were voting would punish them if they didn't pass it. When women did not vote in 1922, and then did not vote in 1924, they cut the budget, and in 1926, they repealed the bill. Women's maternal and infant health improved during those 6 years, and parts of that bill would be incorporated in the Social Security bill, but it wouldn't really be covered again until the 1990s. None of this agenda passed. White women had no power in passing congressional legislation because women were not turning out at the polls. 1920s is also Alice Paul still making trouble, drafts the Equal Rights Amendment, but asks only Republicans to introduce it. So the sort of activist suffragists are annoyed. Margaret Sanger is pressing for birth control. The American Birth Control League has opened in 1923 clinics. By 1930, there will be 300 clinics, including 3 in Harlem, staffed by African-American professionals. But she's too controversial to touch. So white women have gotten to 1930 with nothing. And they're feeling defeated. And then you have the economic upheaval of the Depression. So white women retreat. If they're active at all, they are joining their party organizations as volunteers and maybe appointees. Meanwhile, the Roaring Twenties is bustling away. One of its huge contributions is the acknowledgement of African-American art and music, the Harlem Renaissance. And you would think that that would have given some power to African-American communities, but it did not. I will mention briefly Josephine Baker, who is the Beyonce of the 1920s. She is the first international star, the first Black movie star, huge salary. She left for France in 1917. She'd grown up in St. Louis. Her mother was a domestic worker. And in 1917, there was a vicious race riot in St. Louis where her neighborhood was burned. And she said, I'm not staying here. The white congressman who represented her district, Mr. Dwyer, begins introducing anti-lynching bills based on account of the race riot. And his bill will pass the House. His bill and versions of his bill will pass the House of Representatives into the end of the 1930s and be defeated every time by the Southern filibuster in the Senate, because racism was rampant. Remember, I said the first Women's March on Pennsylvania Avenue was the suffrage march. The second was women members of the Klan. This is 20,000 women in 1925. No masks, not embarrassed to be marching. The violence was horrible. The Klan would go around to Black churches in the South and put a sign on the door saying, if any member of this congregation risks registration, we will lynch him in the sanctuary. But African Americans were escaping. This is the Great Migration that Isabel Wilkerson had written about. And when they got to Los Angeles or Chicago or Philadelphia or New York or Baltimore or Washington, D.C., they are organizing. They're still discriminated against. There are still clans. But to have the worst job in the armor meatpacking plant in Chicago is a lot better job than being a sharecropper. You have better housing, better sewage, better schools, and you can found a political organization. You can register and vote. You can have a newspaper. The first African-American to be elected to the Congress since Reconstruction was elected from Chicago, first an alderman, then a congressman, Oscar DePriest, in 1928, a Republican. And many of his voters had been registered by Ida B. Wells. More about her. So you have Black women in the South as savvy, as focused, as principled as the white women organizers, the rest of the country, but they put themselves at risk every time they tried to do anything. So they are working out of church basements as agricultural agents, as visiting nurses, as teachers. They are teaching a lot of literacy because illiteracy remained rampant in the forest regions of the South. How to register, if you could risk registering. They're enrolling people in the NAACP, which was completely illegal. Rosa Parks joins the NAACP in 1933 as part of a protest of the Scottsboro Boys trial. These women are active in many ways, but most of them we will never know their name. Some of them we will. So very quick introduction. Because none of us has benefited from advanced placement American history of African Americans. And I hope you all know these people. Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells are the principal race women, basically the founding feminists of the civil rights era. They come to prominence in the 1890s. They both grew up or had early careers in Memphis. Mary Church Terrell had two white grandfathers who impregnated slaves, whose offspring they allowed to marry in the parlor of one of their homes. Molly Church was born in her father's owner's home, born during slavery. So she was born enslaved, but emancipation comes, she's freed, and her father has been a privileged house slave and has been educated. And so he becomes a very prominent businessman, possibly the wealthiest Black man in the South. She is sent to Oberlin, which always accepted African Americans and women. She earns multiple degrees, speaks 5 languages, travels in Europe, and her father is wealthy enough that she always wears lace and pearls and will marry a Black lawyer, educated Harvard undergraduate, Howard Law School, was named a judge by McKinley and then an elevated judge by Roosevelt and Taft. She is a very prominent woman. As I said, first head of the National Association of Colored Women, founded in 1896. Wells is among the founders. Both of them will be among the founders of the NAACP. Wells comes from a poorer background. Her parents were sharecroppers in Texas. They die of cholera. She brings all her siblings to Memphis. She starts a printing press and begins to investigate lynching. I mean, this woman is courageous beyond bounds. And in 1892 publishes Southern Horrors, which is the first annotated explanation of why Black men are not being lynched because they whistled at some white woman. They're lynched because they started a competitive grocery store or a livery stable. It's an economic issue. She's chased out of Memphis. Her press is destroyed. She ends up living in Chicago, marries a Black lawyer. They have a quite prosperous life, many children. She remains a leader for a long time, but she is very feisty, less tactful, shall we say, than Mrs. Terrell. So her leadership opportunities are fewer. You'll recognize Mary McLeod Bethune, head of the Black Brain Trust from the New Deal. I had not realized that she was actually the highest ranking woman in the New Deal, or that Eleanor Roosevelt had invited her to come to the founding meeting of the United Nations. So she's the only African-American participating in the founding of the United Nations. When she visited the White House, which at that time still had white guards, Mrs. Roosevelt would walk to the gate to greet her so that she would not be disrespected, and she wanted to be photographed inviting her guest into the White House. Pauli Murray is somebody everybody should know more about. She's a a lawyer. She also is an ally of Eleanor Roosevelt's, whom she meets during the Depression. She is educated as a lawyer. She'll teach at Yale. She'll publish a handbook of discriminatory laws against Blacks state by state that Thurgood Marshall will refer to as the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. She'll become an Episcopal priest and a published poet. And every time there's a Supreme Court nomination, she sends the president a letter saying, nominate me. But her most recent biographers, she was, quote, a woman of questionable sexuality. And her most recent biographers believe that she was a trans woman. And people would have sensed that enough at the time that she did not get as many public roles as she probably deserved. But she's behind the scenes at every major juncture of civil rights advances and women's rights as well. Thurgood Marshall hires Constance Baker Motley because she's married. He did not like to deal with single women either as employees or as plaintiffs, even though he had a reputation as a ladies' man. She will write the brief for the Brown case, and then she will be in charge of, she'll take on all the Southern State Universities desegregation cases. So she walks Charlene Hunter Galt into the University of Georgia and James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. She's everywhere. Septima Clark will lose her job in the segregated Charleston, South Carolina school system for becoming a member of the NAACP and suing for equal wages. She'll join the Highlander School, which was a civil rights activist group. She'll eventually work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, running those freedom schools, Freedom Summer 1964. In 1970, she retires. She moves back to Charleston. She runs for the school board and is elected. And the governor passes a law to restore the 40 years of pension that was taken away from her. It's one of the few happy ending stories. Mamie Till and Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, although active for years, had met Septima Clark at Highlander in the summer of 1955. Mamie Till's son is tortured and murdered in August. Rosa Parks refuses to change her seat, remembering that she was thinking of Emmett Till when she refused to budge in December of 1955. Ella Baker's the backbone of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. When she uses their money to help organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Martin Luther King fires her. Daisy Bates is the matriarch of the Little Rock Nine. In 1957, Diane Nash who's a sophomore at Fisk in 1960. And when the first Freedom Riders are bombed and murdered outside of Anniston, Alabama, and the Freedom Rides sort of shut down, she says, no, more buses, more volunteers, we will fill the jails. And they filled not only the jails, but the state prison farms. Fannie Lou Hamer, this is her testimony in 1964, protesting an all-white Mississippi delegation. And all of these women together, plus lots of women whose names we will never know, who were the conscience and the backbone of the civil rights movement, who left home with toilet paper and toothpaste in their purses because they were likely going to end up in jail if not beaten and left in the road, will lead to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is huge change for everybody. African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, lots of voting going on up until the Shelby v. Holder case, when the Supreme Court removed the enforcement mechanism of voting rights legislation. Going backwards a few, so what are white women doing? White women got charged up, as Black women did by the Second World War, were Rosies. Both Black and white women were Rosies and worked in the military, but then the propaganda told white women that they should go have babies to confront the Cold War, to confront communism, by lots of white children growing up in redline suburbs. And they did, but they were paying attention. They were paying attention to what Black women were doing, and not unlike the 1830s abolition movement helping to generate the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement definitely re-energizes a women's rights movement. So you have, I post this picture because they actually had more women in 1960, but this picture is important because Patsy Mink, fourth in the back row from Hawaii, is the first woman of color to serve in the Congress. And I always like to include Margaret Chase Smith for her Declaration of Conscience speech against McCarthy. But women are beginning, by the 60s, women are beginning to be elected and to stay in power. These are not appointed women. These are women who ran in their own right. I say that, although Margaret Chase Smith replaced her husband, who died of syphilis, and won his seat by more votes than he had ever won them, first in the House and then in the Senate. She's the first woman to serve in both. Martha Griffiths is the second Carrie Chapman Catt. Brilliant strategist. She gets sex into Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. She gets the Equal Rights Amendment out of the House Judiciary Committee using a discharge petition. And so we're rushing into the 1970s with women, Black and white women, feeling pretty empowered. There's going to be an Equal Rights Amendment. There's going to be lots of legislation. Title IX, huge. Equal Credit Act, pregnancy discrimination stuff is happening in the House, in the Congress, stuff is happening in the Supreme Court, partly because Ruth Bader Ginsburg is leading the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU and bringing these cases. But then Roe gets handed down. Nobody was expecting Roe. No one was expecting the Equal Rights Amendment to pass. So it had no network in the states, as Carrie Chapman Catt had established, ready for ratification. No one had been lobbying for Roe, other than some liberal doctors in the American Medical Association who were responsible in the 1850s when they were not liberal doctors. It's the American Medical Association that made abortion illegal in this country. It was not until the 1850s. But they're thinking they should change their mind by the 1950s and 60s. And so things are beginning to happen, but nobody expected Roe and nobody expected the backlash to Roe. Enter Phyllis, the third brilliant strategist. Phyllis is able to pull together the white Southerners who were mad about civil rights and voting rights, all those actions, and who'd voted for George Wallace and Nixon, who were moving away from the Democratic Party. Evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics who were upset about Roe, and then a bunch of people who were just offended by long-haired boys burning draft cards and by long-haired girls not wearing underwear, and they wanted a return to family values. So working with conservative ministers like Jerry Falwell, she creates the Family Values Coalition, which is basically conservatives from both political parties, where the parties had been quite diverse, which enabled them to get things done, to work across the aisle. She pulls together conservatives from both parties, and she hands them to Ronald Reagan, thinking she's going to be named Secretary of Defense. He knows better, but he wins with this conservative coalition, this Family Values Coalition. The Republican platform is rewritten, takes out the Equal Rights Amendment, takes out choice, puts in litmus tests for judges, puts in a lot of conservative language, and you begin to have, from 1980 until 2020, you begin to have a nibbling back of rights for women. You occasionally have something good happen. The court doesn't go quite so far as it might in getting rid of Roe in some of the decisions in the 90s. There's some rights passed for the disabled. There's some rights passed for LGBTQ, but on the whole, it's a downward movement. We're not doing as well as we might think we are, or we aren't doing as well for the entire country as we might. So despite Sandra Day O'Connor and Sally Ride and Geraldine Ferraro, it really is the beginning of a downhill slope. I have to add one quick footnote. When Sally Ride went up, all of those women who had been part of the Women's Army Corps, who had worked in addition to being drivers and secretaries and staff during the war, many of them had been pilots. And they were at the takeoff of Sally Ride's mission. And her mother will say, "Thank God for Gloria Steinem." In my book, I illustrate the Ferraro nomination with her campaign button, and it came from Sally Ride's collection, which has been donated to the Air and Space Museum. So rushing just directly to Dobbs, Dobbs is sort of the culmination of the divisions in the country that began in the 1970s. And for all the gains women have made in the 100 years, and there have been enormous gains for both Black and white and Hispanic and Asian American and every kind of woman, even the women who opposed all of these gains, there have been gains. They haven't reached quite far enough, not to enough poor and disadvantaged and underrepresented women, but conditions are clearly better than they were in 1920. this is huge, to lose the constitutional right to have an abortion. As Justice Ginsburg said, when government controls that decision, she's being treated as less than a full adult human. So here we are. My last chapter is titled Not Enough. Women have made, as I say, lots and lots of progress, but in every one of these areas, you can say yes, but. Yes, but. Many women are now serving in the military, including in combat, but many women are leaving the military for sexual harassment. Elected office, I hope you know all those statistics, that the highest number of women in this country serve at the lowest level of school boards and city councils, that we are only, 38% of state legislatures and 27% of the House, 25% of the Senate. We now have 12 governors, an all-time high. But in all these other ways, women are not progressing, and the right to abortion is a huge threat. The not having a constitutional right to abortion is a huge threat. Secretary General, just last March, women's rights are being abused, threatened, and violated, not only in the United States, but around the world. And we see women fighting back around the world, but none has been victorious, one could say, yet. So I return you to founding mothers. I especially honor Coretta Scott King, because I think this freedom is never really won. I think we became complacent about what we had won and thought that we would never have to keep fighting for it. And now we're starting a third century and more struggle. This was Anthony's gravesite in Rochester, New York in 2016, when people thought Hillary was going to win. Since then, people continue to flock there. And now the cemetery has covered it with plexiglass because the stickers are hurting the stone. But voting makes all the difference. We have to vote. And I know that your organization is educating people to vote, encouraging people to vote, organizing debates. You are engaged in keeping women focused on why they need to be active citizens. And for those of you who might be watching this when it's aired, if you want more information from me or you would like to order a book that's signed, I can send it to you. Just email me in that regard. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to, well, I don't want to, it's there. So I'll stop the share because I know Effie has this information. You can find ways to reach me if you need. But if I stop the share, then I can see you. So hello, everybody.
Thank you, Betsy. Can I have everybody with me applaud? Thank you.
Well, I realize I have 1 minute left, so I'm sorry.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Take some
So
questions.
quicker, but I have to say this, I mean, I'm compelled by this topic. There are so many good stories. So
We would love if you would entertain us with a little bit more of your time for a few questions, maybe.
I'd love to, if there are questions, I would love to answer them. Sometimes
Just very quickly, are there any questions for our guests this afternoon?
Sometimes I worry it's such a fire hose of information, as the book is. The book is really fact-packed that you have to pause to absorb. So
yes, I've paused and pick it back up. I urge everybody, this is, as you heard, a very clear-eyed, nuanced account of our history that, I think sometimes we think it's all just, a straight path and everything was known at the time of how the outcome would be and the different players and how they either worked together or didn't work together, but how sometimes it, in spite of that.
I really want to commend you all because I think, I think this fight is now going to be in local communities and local and state legislatures, and the work you are doing as organizers and educators in those areas, sort of civics, advocates of civics and civic engagement. This is just critical to the democracy. So I am very grateful to you for the work you are doing.
Judy, do you have a question for our speaker?
I do. One of the things that we had a meet and greet, virtual meet and greet yesterday in preparation for today. And one of the comments that came up during that session was, the league is too nice. We go so far so as not to offend that we're not very effective. And I was struck by the fact that you commented on that as though the early equal rights fighters only succeeded because they were nice, and the ones who weren't nice didn't. So I'd like you to comment on that and how it plays out these days.
Well, let me clarify first. Carrie Chapman Catt was not nice. She was a tough operator. And I think the League chose to be nice in 1920 when it followed Jane Addams' direction that we should be educational and inclusive and community-based, that we shouldn't be feisty and partisan. And that, I mean, who's to say, if you were living in 1920 and one of those women, that that would have been a very persuasive argument, because you don't, you know, you're trying to bring people in, and you don't usually bring people in by being too controversial. I think that we have been socialized for decades and generations to be nice women, to be inclusive, to be to try to get things done through courtesy and politeness. How well did that serve the woman who was interviewing Trump the other night on CNN? And she abandoned politeness, professional politeness, for sort of tough responses pretty soon. I think I mean, I know that the League has national principles and likely state principles as well, but I think that that you can choose. I think once you've chosen the causes for which you are lobbying, then you can push pretty hard, I would think. But I'm never going to argue against niceness or good manners. I think what we need to do is get back to that. We need to get back to being able to have civil. Some communities are starting these conversations where you invite people who disagree with you. Everybody invites one person who might not agree with them, and you try to have dinner together and see if you can have a conversation, if you can find any common ground. It is so hard, because whereas we used to sort of get our facts from Walter Cronkite and then you could debate the issue, now, in my opinion, we have facts and no facts, making any debate really a challenge. I don't have an answer, but these issues, the issues confronting women today, issues of reproductive rights, employment rights, healthcare, ongoing racial division, need to at least be confronted. And maybe they're confronted by educational forums where you're presenting information. And in that way, you're being pretty straightforward.
Thank you. Any other questions for our speakers?
There's a hand up. I see a hand up over there.
Oh, who is that?
Over here.
Hi, hello.
Hi,
Hello.
Terry.
Hi. I just have a question about gerrymandering.
Oh.
Is how can we, or do you have any thoughts about how we can deal with it?
I do love the states, of course, that have commissions, and the commissions have invited the League and other organizations like you to draw the lines. But I also think that part of it is going to be the issues. Part of it we cannot get away from, because people choose to live in urban areas or in rural areas, and it's hard to draw districts. I now live in Maryland, and I'm in a pretty compact district. But when I lived in Virginia, my district went from the Potomac River almost all the way to the Shenandoah Mountains. It was this little eel that went out. To be, at that time, it was to be a Republican district. It's now controlled by Democrats. But I think it's a huge challenge. I think it's, even if we weren't dealing with the fierceness of the partisanship we're dealing with, and you were just trying to create, you know, sort of blocks of equal population, I think it would be hard. But this whole, and it also turns back to the Dobbs decision. Part of Justice, well, let me just say, because this outrages me, Justice Alito made 67 references to the history of abortion in America. He said that there are no historical roots of abortion in America, and that was the first of 67 statements which are factually wrong. But he also said that one of the purposes of his decision was to hand this whole thing back to the states, where it would be more democratically decided, which might be true if you had voting rights that were protected in the states. And you didn't have, 29 states controlled by one party. They aren't all Democratic states. They aren't all Republican states, but one party control is not a healthy thing, because you have somebody taking this group out of that group. We do not have, I think focusing on gerrymandering and how to protect people's voting rights has got to be the starting point, because then you can vote for the state legislatures who are making these laws. And you all are in a position to do that. I am naturally an optimist, and I think that we'll get through this. America's been through bad stuff and turned itself around. I am very optimistic about young people. I think they have grown up in more diverse schools and communities than I did. I think they're already working on issues of gun control and climate change. And so I think they have a sense of how to politically organize. I want them to turn, from my perspective, to more feminist issues, but I think they will. And I think we all need to be allies of each other. So I'm going to support them in what they do in hopes that they support my causes as well. Such good questions, of course, from League of Women Voters, women and men.
Absolutely.
So
Well-
if something occurs to you as you're reading the book or in your conversations later in the day, feel free to send me an email or get Effie to pass on the information. I'm glad to participate, and I was honored to be invited. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for coming. This was a real treat for all of us. And
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank
Very
you.
informative.
On
Thank you so
behalf of
much.
the league. Yes, thank you very
all.
much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, you want to stop the recording now, Julie?